Good evening, everybody. I'm sitting with my hot chocolate, my Christmas tree, and I'm ready to read you a Christmas story. Tastes nice. The story I've chosen is The Christmas Miracle of Jonathon Toomey. It's a really beautifully illustrated book, and I really like it because it really tells a story about the Nativity. I love nativity scenes. In my house and on my Christmas tree, I have lots of little characters from the nativity story. And at the end of the video, I'll show you some of the pictures that I have of my nativity scenes around my house. It's quite a long story, so you'll have to bear with me. The village children called him Mr. Gloomy, but in fact his name was Toomey, Jonathon Toomey. And though it's not kind to call people names, one thing was that this name fitted him quite well. For Jonathon Toomey seldom smiled and he never laughed. He went about mumbling and grumbling, muttering and spluttering, grumping and griping. He often complained that the church bells rang too often, the birds sang too shrilly, and that the children played too loudly. Mr. Toomey was a wood carver. Some said that he was the best wood carver in the whole valley. He spent his days sitting at a workbench carving beautiful shapes from blocks of pine and hickory and chestnut wood. After supper, he sat in a straight-back chair near the fireplace, smoking his pipe and staring into the flames. Jonathon Toomey wasn't an old man, but if you saw him, you might think he was. The way he walked bent forwards with his head down. You wouldn't notice his eyes, the clear blue of an August sky. You wouldn't see the dimple on his chin, since his face was mostly hidden under a shaggy, untrimmed beard, speckled with sawdust, and the wood shavings, and depending on what he'd eaten that day, crumbs of bread, or a bit of potato, or some dry gravy. The village people didn't know it, but there was a reason for his gloom, a reason for his grumbling. A reason why he walked hunched over as if carrying a great weight on his shoulders. Some years earlier, when Jonathon Toomey was young and full of life and full of love, his wife and baby had become very ill. And because those were the days before hospitals and medicines and skilled doctors, his wife and baby had died 3 days apart. So Jonathon Toomey had packed his belongings into a wagon and travelled till his tears stopped. He settled into a tiny house at the edge of a village to do his wood carving. One day in early December, there was a knock at Jonathon's door. Mumbling and grumbling, he went to answer it, and there stood a woman and a young boy. "I'm the widow McDowell. I'm new to your village, and this is my son Thomas," the woman said. "I'm 7 and I know how to whistle," said Thomas. "Whistling," said the wood carver gruffly. "I need something carved," said the woman, and she told Jonathon about a very special set of figures her grandfather had carved for her when she was a girl. "After I moved here, I discovered that they were lost," she explained. "I had hoped by some miracle I would find them again, but it hasn't happened." "There's no such thing as miracles," said the wood carver. "Now, could you describe these figures for me?" "There were sheep," she told him, "2 of them, with curly wool," added Thomas. "Yes, 2, said the widow, "and a cow and an angel, Mary, Joseph and the baby Jesus, and the wise men." "3 of them, said Thomas. "Will you take the job?" asked the widow McDowell. "I will," said the man. "I'm grateful. How soon can you have them ready?" "They will be ready when they are ready," he said. "But I must have them by Christmas. They mean so much to me. I can't remember a Christmas without them." "Christmas," said Jonathon gruffly, and he shut the door. The following week, there was another knock at the wood carver's door. Muttering and spluttering, he went to answer it. There stood the widow McDowell and Thomas. "Excuse me," said the widow, "but Thomas has been begging to come to watch you work. He wants to be a wood carver when he grows up and would like to watch you, since you are the best in the valley." "I'll be quiet. You won't even know I'm here. Please, please," piped in Thomas. With a grumble, the woodcarver stepped aside to let them in. He pointed to a stool near his workbench. "No talking, no jiggling, no noise," he ordered Thomas. The widow McDowell handed Mr. Toomey a warm loaf of cornbread as a token of thanks. Then she took out her knitting, sat down in a rocking chair in the far corner of the cottage. "Not there!" bellowed the woodcarver. "No one sits in that chair." So she moved to the straight back chair by the fire. Thomas sat very still. Once when he needed to sneeze, he pressed a finger under his nose to hold it back. Once when he wanted desperately to scratch his leg, he counted to 20 to keep his mind off the itch. After a very long time, Thomas cleared his throat and whispered, "Mr. Toomey, can I ask a question?" The woodcarver glared at Thomas, then shrugged his shoulders and grunted. Thomas decided this meant yes, so he went on. "Is that my sheep you're carving?" The woodcarver nodded and grunted again. After another long time, Thomas whispered, "Mr. Toomey, excuse me. I know you're carving my sheep, but you're carving it wrong." The widow McDowell's knitting needles stopped clicking. Jonathon Toomey's knife stopped carving. Thomas went on, "It's a beautiful sheep, nice and curly, but my sheep looked happy." "Sheep are sheep," said Jonathon Toomey. "They can't look happy." "Mine did," answered Thomas. "They knew they were with the baby Jesus, so they were happy." After that, Thomas went quiet for the rest of the afternoon. When the church bells chimed 6 o'clock, Mr. Toomey grumbled under his breath about the awful noise. The widow McDowell said it was time to leave, and Thomas sneezed 3 times, then thanked the woodcarver for allowing him to watch. That evening, after a supper of cornbread and boiled potatoes, the woodcarver sat down at his bench. He picked up his knife, he picked up the sheep, and he worked until his eyes drooped shut. A few days later, there was a knock on the woodcarver's door. Griping and grumbling, he went to answer it. There stood the widow and her son. "May I watch again?" "I will be quiet," said Thomas. He settled himself on the stool very quietly, while his mother laid a basket of sweet-smelling raisin buns on the table. "The teapot is warm," Mr. Toomey said gruffly, his head bent over his work. While Mr. Toomey carved, the widow McDowell poured tea. She touched the woodcarver gently on the shoulder and placed a cup of tea and a bun next to him. He pretended not to notice, but soon both the plate and the cup were empty. Thomas tried to eat the bun his mother had given him as quietly as he could, but it's almost impossible to be 7 and eat a cake, a warm, sticky raisin cake, without making various smacking, licking and satisfied noises. When Thomas had finished, he tried to sit quietly. Once he almost hiccuped, but he took a deep breath and held it till his face turned red. And once, without thinking, he began to swing his legs, but with a glare from the woodcarver, he stopped, and he kept them so still they fell asleep. After a very long time, Thomas whispered, "Mr. Toomey, excuse me, can I ask a question?" Grunted Mr. Toomey. "Is that my cow you're carving?" Another long time went by. Then Thomas cleared his throat and said, "Mr. Toomey, excuse me, but I must tell you something. That is a beautiful cow. The most beautiful cow I have ever seen, but it's not right. My cow looked proud." "Proud? Cows are cows," said Mr. Toomey. "They can't look proud." Thomas was quiet the rest of the afternoon. Only sounds that could be heard were the scraping of the carving knife, the humming of the widow McDowell, and the click-click of her knitting needles. When the church bells chimed at 6 o'clock, Mr. Toomey muttered under his breath about the noise. The widow McDowell said it was time for them to leave. Thomas shook one leg and then the other, and he thanked the woodcarver for allowing him to watch. That evening, after a supper of boiled potatoes and raisin buns, the woodcarver sat down at his bench. He picked up the carving knife, he picked up the cow, and he worked until his eyelids drooped shut. A few days later, there was a knock on the woodcarver's door. He smoothed down his hair as he went to answer it. At the door were the widow and her son. "May I watch again?" asked Thomas. As Mrs. McDowell warmed the tea and put a plate of fresh molasses biscuits on the workbench, Thomas watched the woodcarver work on the figure of an angel. After a very long time, Thomas spoke. "Mr. Toomey, excuse me, but is that my angel you're carving?" "Yes, and would you do me the favour of telling me exactly what I'm doing wrong?" "Well, my angel looked like one of God's most important angels, because it was sent to the baby Jesus." "And just how does one make an angel look important?" asked the woodcarver. "You'll be able to do it," said Thomas. "You are the best woodcarver in the valley." After another very long time, Thomas spoke. "Mr. Toomey, may I ask a question?" "Do you ever stop talking?" asked the woodcarver. "My mother says I don't. She says I could learn about the virtue of silence from you." Under his beard, the woodcarver's face turned pink. The widow McDowell's face turned as red as the scarf she was knitting. "Well, speak up. What is your question?" "Will you please teach me how to carve?" "I'm a very busy man," grumbled the woodcarver. But he put down the most important angel and said, "You will carve a bird. A robin, I hope," said Thomas. "I like robins. I like robins too." With a piece of charcoal, the woodcarver sketched a robin on a piece of brown paper. He handed Thomas a small block of pine and a knife. He showed him how to lop the corners from the block and slowly smooth the edges of the wood into curves. Thomas copied the woodcarver's strokes, head bent, tongue working from side to side of his lower lip as he concentrated. When the church bells chimed 6 o'clock, Jonathon Toomey was holding Thomas's hand, guiding the knife along the edge of a wing. He didn't hear them ringing. The widow McDowell said it was time to leave. Thomas brushed wood shavings from his shirt. Then he reached out and brushed 2 especially large pieces of wood shavings from Jonathon Toomey's beard. He thanked the woodcarver for teaching him how to carve. Later, after a supper of boiled potatoes and molasses biscuits, Jonathon Toomey went to his workbench. He thought for a very long time. He sketched a drawing after drawing. Finally, he picked up his carving knife. He picked up the angel. He carved and he carved until his eyelids drooped shut. A few days later, there was a knock at the door. Mr. Toomey jumped up to answer it. There stood the widow McDowell with a bouquet of pine branches and holly sprigs dotted with berries. And there stood Thomas, clutching his partly carved robin. While Thomas and Mr. Toomey carved, Mrs. McDowell put the branches of a jar in a jar of water. She scrubbed Mr. Toomey's kitchen table and set the jar into the centre on a pretty cloth embroidered with lilies of the valley and daisies, which she found in a drawer below the cupboard. "Next I will carve wise men and Joseph," the woodcarver said to Thomas. "Perhaps before I begin you will tell me about all the mistakes I'm going to make." "Well," said Thomas, "my wise men were wearing the most wonderful robes because they were going to visit Jesus. And my Joseph was leaning over the baby Jesus like he was protecting him. He looked very serious." It wasn't until the church bells had chimed and the widow and her son were preparing to go that Mr. Toomey saw the jar of pine branches and the scrubbed table and the cloth embroidered with the lilies of the valley and daisies. "I found the cloth in the drawer. I thought it would look pretty on the table." "Never open that drawer," Jonathon said, and he left the towel. "Never open that drawer," the woodcarver said. And when the two had left, Jonathon put the cloth away. That evening, after a supper of boiled potatoes, the woodcarver worked on Joseph and the wise men until his eyelids drooped shut. I think he's putting a lot of effort into this. A few days later, there was a knock on the woodcarver's door. He dusted the crumbs from his beard and brushed the sawdust from his shirt. At the door were the widow McDowell and Thomas. All afternoon, Thomas watched the woodcarver work. When it was time to leave, Jonathon said to Thomas, "I'm about to begin the last two figures, Mary and the baby. Can you tell me, how did your baby look?" "Well, they were the most special of all," said Thomas. "Jesus was smiling and reaching up to his mother, and Mary looked like she loved him very much." "Thank you, Thomas," said the woodcarver. "Tomorrow is Christmas. Is there any chance the figures will be ready?" the widow McDowell asked. "They will be ready when they are ready." "I understand," said the widow, and she handed Jonathon two parcels. "Merry Christmas," she said. Jonathon folded his arms across his chest. "I want no presents," he said harshly. "And that is exactly why we are giving them," answered the widow. She put them down on the table and left. Jonathon sat down at the table. Slowly he opened the first parcel. Inside was a red scarf, hand knitted, warm and bright. He tied the scarf around his neck. The other parcel held a robin, crudely carved of pine. A smile twitched at the corners of Jonathon's mouth as he ran his fingers over the lopsided wings. He dusted the mantelpiece with his sleeve and placed the robin exactly in the centre so he could look at it from his chair. I think he liked it. The woodcarver did not eat supper that day. Instead, he began to sketch the final figures, Mary and Jesus. He drew Mary, then crumpled the sketch into a ball and tossed it on the floor. He drew the baby, crumpled the sketch and tossed it onto the floor, along with the first. He sketched again. Once more he crumpled the paper. Soon there was a small mountain of crumpled paper at his feet. He picked up a block of wood and tried to carve, but his knife would not do what he wanted it to do. He hurled the chunk of wood into the fireplace and sat, staring into the flames. When he heard the church bells announcing midnight, he got up. Slowly he opened the drawer beneath the cupboard, the drawer he had told the widow never to open. From it he took the cloth embroidered with lilies of the valley and daisies. He took out a rough woolen shawl and a lace handkerchief. He took out a tiny white baby blanket and a pair of blue socks. He placed each piece gently on the floor. From the bottom of the drawer he lifted out a picture frame, beautifully carved of deep brown chestnut wood. In the frame was a charcoal sketch of a woman sitting in a rocking chair holding a baby. The baby's arms were reaching up, touching the woman's face. The woman was looking down at the baby, smiling. Jonathon sat in the rocking chair and held the picture. He rocked slowly, his eyes closed. 2 tears trailed into his beard. When he finally took the picture to his workbench and began to carve, his fingers worked quickly and surely. He carved all through the night. The next day there was a knock on the widow McDowell's door. When she opened it, there stood the woodcarver with his neck wrapped in a red scarf, holding the wooden box stuffed with straw. "Mr. Toomey," said the widow. "What a surprise! Merry Christmas!" "The figures are ready," he said as he stepped inside. From the box, Jonathon unpacked 2 curly sheep, happy sheep because they were with Jesus. He unpacked a proud cow and an angel, a very important angel with mighty wings stretching from his shoulders right down to the hem of his gown. He unpacked 3 wise men wearing the most wonderful robes edged with fur and falling in rich folds. He unpacked a serious and caring Joseph. He unpacked Mary wearing a rough woolen shawl, looking down lovingly on her precious baby son. Jesus was smiling and reaching up to touch his mother's face. That day, Jonathon went to the Christmas service with the widow McDowell and Thomas. And that day in the churchyard, the village children saw Jonathon throw back his head, showing his eyes as clear as the August sky, and laugh. And no one ever called him Mr. Gloomy again. I hope you enjoyed that story. Now let's have a little look at some of our nativity scenes around the Doran-Hannon house. Merry Christmas, everyone.